in the summer of 1944, amid the hedgerows of Normandy, an American M4 Sherman crests into firing position. The range is close enough to feel decisive. The Panther ahead is broadside only in theory. In practice, its nose faces forward, low and confident. The American gunner steadies the sight picture. He fires first. The 76mm round leaves the barrel with a sharp concussion that rattles the turret interior. For a fraction of a second, the crew expects the impact to end the encounter. Instead, the shell strikes the Panther's glacis plate and skips away, deflected upward in a hard metallic flash. The sound is unmistakable, not penetration, but rejection. Steel has met steel and lost. Inside the German tank, nothing changes. The Panther crew does not flinch. They have watched this happen before, often enough that the sound no longer signals danger. The sloped armor has done exactly what it was designed to do. The glacis remains intact, the interior untouched. The gunner calmly begins his return sequence. Inside the Sherman, realization arrives faster than fear. The men understand the meaning of a bounced shot. Training manuals had promised that at this range, penetration was possible. Tables, charts, and classroom lectures had all pointed to this moment ending differently. But the battlefield does not negotiate with doctrine. It answers only to physics. Seconds stretch in a way no rehearsal ever prepared them for. The loader's hands move automatically, but the mood in the turret has shifted. The advantage of initiative is gone. The enemy is not damaged, not slowed, not surprised. Somewhere across the short distance, a German gun is already traversing toward them. This is the instant when abstraction collapses. Armor thickness is no longer a number on a page. Slope is no longer a diagram. Superiority is no longer theoretical. It is visible, audible, and final. The Sherman is now reacting, not acting. When the Panther fires back, it will do so with confidence earned through repetition. And as the American crew braces for the next sound, they begin to understand something that will define their war from this point forward. Not all tanks are equals when steel meets steel head-on. Tank combat in Europe is rarely cinematic. There are no prolonged duels, no measured exchanges. Encounters are sudden, violent, and usually over in moments. When two armored vehicles meet, the outcome is often decided by the first shell that penetrates. Survival does not belong to the brave, but to the intact. The physics of armor dominate everything that follows. Thickness determines resistance. Slope multiplies it. Metallurgy decides whether steel absorbs force or fails under it. These factors outweigh courage, training, and intent. Crews may perform flawlessly and still lose if their armor cannot endure the first impact. In this environment, heroism has little time to express itself. German tank design reflects this understanding. Vehicles like the Panther are built to prevail in frontal encounters, where visibility, armor geometry, and gun performance converge. Their designers assume that the first shot will be taken head-on and that it must count. The result is a machine optimized to face danger directly and survive it. American doctrine rests on a different assumption. U.S. planners believe maneuver will resolve most armored threats. Speed, coordination, and combined arms are expected to create opportunities for flanking shots. Tanks are not meant to duel enemy armor alone. They are part of a system, one element in a larger orchestration of firepower. That logic depends on space. It assumes open ground, visibility, and freedom of movement. In Normandy, those assumptions collapse. The hedgerows fracture fields into narrow corridors, forcing tanks into short-range confrontations. Visibility shrinks. Maneuver disappears. The battlefield funnels opposing vehicles toward one another, front to front, at distances where armor and gun performance decide everything. In this terrain, theory offers no escape. The Sherman cannot disengage easily, cannot circle wide, cannot rely on speed to recover initiative. It is drawn into the kind of fight it was never designed to dominate. What was meant to be a supporting weapon becomes the primary target. The result is not a failure of crews, but a collision between design philosophy and reality. Steel, not strategy, dictates the terms. And As American tankers adapt to this brutal arithmetic, a deeper question begins to form: what happens when doctrine cannot change fast enough to save the men who must fight inside it? The Panther is not merely a heavier tank, it is a different answer to the same question. Its designers combine sharply sloped frontal armor with a high-velocity gun intended to strike first and penetrate decisively. The vehicle is built around the assumption that encounters will be frontal, brief, and unforgiving, and that it must survive them intact. Against this geometry, standard Sherman ammunition struggles to matter. The Panther's glacis plate turns incoming rounds aside, transforming direct hits into harmless deflections. What appears thin on paper becomes thick in practice, not through mass alone, but through angle. The result is functional immunity at the very moment when American crews expect effect. German crews know this. They trust the armor in front of them, not as a hope, but as a tested certainty. When a Sherman fires head-on, panic does not follow. Procedure does. The Panther holds its position, absorbs the strike, and prepares its reply. Confidence is not emotional, it is structural. Distance compounds the imbalance. German optics are designed for clarity at range, and their guns retain penetration, where American rounds begin to fail. Engagements open farther than Sherman crews, prefer and close faster than doctrine predicts. Every meter favors the Panther's design logic. American gunners do everything correctly. They estimate range, adjust lead, steady their aim. The shot lands where it is supposed to, and still it fails. Again and again, the same sound returns. Impact without entry. Each bounce teaches the same lesson, but offers no solution. Those who survive report identical sequences. The first round strikes and glances away. The return fire arrives almost immediately. Loss follows. The pattern becomes so consistent that it no longer surprises, it simply erodes expectation. Victory feels improbable before the fight has fully begun. Confidence drains long before official doctrine changes. Crews learn through repetition that they are entering engagements already behind the curve. The Panther does not need to outthink them. It only needs to wait. And as this realization spreads quietly through the ranks, the imbalance begins to feel permanent, unless something unseen can alter the equation before too many more shots bounce away. The M4 Sherman is not conceived as a duelist. It is designed instead as a reliable instrument of movement, mechanically dependable, easy to produce, and simple to maintain across vast distances. Its creators do not imagine it standing nose to nose with enemy heavy armor. They imagine it rolling forward endlessly, always present, always available, a tool of momentum rather than confrontation. American armored doctrine reflects this philosophy. Victory is expected to come from numbers, coordination, and logistics, rather than individual superiority. Tanks are meant to exploit breakthroughs, not force them. If enemy armor appears, it is to be handled by specialized units, supported by artillery, aircraft, and infantry. The system is designed to overwhelm, not to duel. Within this structure, tank destroyers are assigned a clear role. They are faster, more heavily armed, and doctrinally tasked with defeating enemy tanks. Shermans, by contrast, are intended to support infantry, suppress defenses, and move rapidly through contested ground. Armor penetration is considered useful, but not decisive. It is one capability among many, not the defining requirement. This logic is not careless. It grows out of earlier campaigns where flexibility and combined arms prove effective. Against older German vehicles, the system works well enough. The Sherman's reliability keeps units moving. Replacement vehicles arrive quickly. Losses, while painful, do not halt momentum. The doctrine appears validated by progress on the map, but doctrine assumes a battlefield that cooperates. It assumes space to maneuver, time to coordinate, and clear distinctions between roles. In Normandy, those assumptions fail almost immediately. The terrain compresses the fight. Tank destroyers struggle to position effectively. Infantry advances draw Shermans into the front line, where enemy armor is waiting. Germany, meanwhile, has changed the terms of engagement. The Panther is not designed as a niche counter. It is built to dominate the frontal fight. It collapses the separation between roles by forcing every encounter into its preferred geometry. There is no safe distance, no clean handoff to another unit. The Sherman is confronted directly, repeatedly, and without preparation. Armor penetration, once secondary, becomes existential. The ability to survive a head-on engagement is no longer optional, it is the price of entry. The Sherman's design philosophy, sound in theory, now reveals its limits under pressure. What was meant to be a strength reliance on system-wide solutions becomes a vulnerability when the system cannot deploy fast enough. In Normandy, belief meets evidence. Doctrine does not collapse overnight, but it begins to crack. And as American crews face Panthers in terrain that denies maneuver, a quiet realization spreads. The war they trained for is not the war they are fighting, and adaptation will not come easily or without cost. American planners enter the European campaign with confidence rooted in systems rather than machines. Combined arms doctrine promises balance. Infantry to protect tanks, artillery to suppress resistance, aircraft to destroy what armor cannot reach. Within this framework, no single weakness is meant to be fatal. Gaps are to be compensated for, not eliminated. Industrial capacity reinforces this belief. The United States does not merely build tanks, it replaces them at a pace no adversary can match. Production figures become a form of reassurance. If a vehicle is lost, another will arrive. If a unit is depleted, it will be reconstituted. Protection is measured not only in steel, but in output. From this perspective, losses are framed as tolerable. Crews are trained to escape burning tanks, and survivability statistics appear to support the approach. Men live, vehicles burn, and the advance continues. On paper, the arithmetic holds. In reality, each loss carries consequences that spreadsheets do not record. Intelligence reports compound the problem. Early assessments downplay the number of Panthers in the field, treating them as exceptions rather than a growing standard. Encounters are explained away as anomalies. The pattern emerging at the front is softened as it moves up the chain of command, diluted by optimism and distance. Crew survivability data further obscures the issue. The fact that many tankers survive penetrations is taken as evidence that the system works. What those numbers do not show is the tactical failure that precedes survival, the engagements lost, the ground ceded, the initiative surrendered. Living through a defeat does not make it less of one. The cost is paid by the men inside the tanks. They fight with equipment deemed sufficient by strategic logic, but inadequate by battlefield experience. Each engagement reinforces the same lesson. Good enough is a concept that belongs far from the front. It offers no protection when steel meets steel. Confidence, once useful, becomes inertia. The urgency to adapt is delayed because the system has not yet broken, but systems fail slowly, one crew at a time. And as belief continues to outrun evidence, the question grows sharper: how many losses will it take before good enough is no longer acceptable? German armored doctrine begins with a simple premise. The first effective shot decides the fight. From this assumption flows an entire design philosophy centered on frontal dominance. Tanks are built to face the enemy directly, absorb incoming fire, and return a lethal response before the opponent can recover. Survival is engineered into the approach itself. Armor slope is the cornerstone of this thinking. By angling steel rather than thickening it alone, German designers multiply effective protection without excessive weight. The Panther's glacis plate embodies this logic, turning shells away while preserving mobility. Geometry becomes a weapon, as decisive as the gun it shields. That gun is chosen with equal clarity of purpose. High-velocity cannons are intended to penetrate at range, before the enemy can close or maneuver. Penetration tables are not theoretical exercises. They are the foundation of confidence. German crews expect their first shot to end the engagement, and their training reinforces that expectation relentlessly. Training further reflects this philosophy. Crews are taught to hold ground, not evade. Withdrawal is not the default response to contact, dominance is. When confronted, the Panther is meant to remain steady, trusting its armor and gun to resolve the encounter. Movement serves positioning, not escape. This breeds expectation. Panthers anticipate Shermans to die while approaching, their rounds glancing harmlessly off sloped steel before return fire arrives. The pattern repeats often enough to feel inevitable. Confidence is reinforced not by doctrine alone, but by repeated confirmation on the battlefield. German doctrine rewards this behavior. Head-on confrontation is not merely accepted, it is encouraged when conditions favor it. Tactical manuals and battlefield culture align to reinforce the same message. Face the enemy, fire first, and trust the machine to do the rest. Over time, the imbalance becomes structural. It is no longer just a matter of one tank outperforming another, but of an entire system designed around winning frontal encounters meeting one that is not. The result is asymmetry, embedded at every level, from engineering to training to expectation. And as this philosophy collides repeatedly with American assumptions, it raises an uncomfortable possibility: what happens when one side designs for inevitability and the other must learn it the hard way? Adaptation begins at the lowest level, where theory offers no protection. Sherman crews do not wait for revised manuals or doctrinal updates. They learn in real time, under fire, absorbing lessons measured in seconds. Each encounter sharpens behavior. Each loss strips away assumption. What survives is what works. Flanking ceases to be a tactic and becomes an obsession. Crews no longer speak of maneuver as an option, but as a requirement. The front of a Panther is no longer a challenge, it is a prohibition. Gunners search instinctively for side angles, rear plates, anything that breaks the geometry of defeat. Movement is constant, restless, urgent. Smoke replaces armor where steel cannot suffice. White clouds are laid deliberately, not to conceal retreat, but to deny certainty. Vision becomes contested. Range is disrupted. The Panther's advantages are blunted not by penetration, but by confusion. Smoke buys time, and time is survival. Speed is redefined. It is no longer about exploitation or advance, but about avoidance. Acceleration becomes evasive rather than aggressive. Engines are pushed not to close distance, but to escape it. Every second spent stationary feels dangerous. Mobility is no longer a strength, it is a necessity. Casualties accelerate understanding faster than any classroom. Crews observe which tanks return and which do not. Patterns emerge without being written down. A stationary Sherman dies, a frontal approach fails. A single exposed moment can be final. These truths spread laterally, crew to crew, faster than official acknowledgement. As this informal education deepens, the questions change. Crews stop asking for thicker armor or new tanks. They begin asking about ammunition. They compare shells. They trade rumors. Which round penetrated? At what range? Under what conditions? The conversation narrows with precision. The problem is no longer framed as platform versus platform. The Sherman itself recedes as the central issue. Attention shifts inward, toward the projectile leaving the barrel. If armor cannot be changed quickly, perhaps effect can. Perhaps physics can be altered where steel cannot. This realization does not bring immediate relief. Ammunition choices are limited, supplies constrained, information incomplete. But the framing matters. It transforms despair into focus. The enemy is no longer invulnerable by definition, only resistant under current conditions. Command will take time to catch up. Doctrine will lag behind experience. But inside the turrets, the truth is already understood. The war is not lost, because the Sherman exists. It is lost when the wrong shell is fired. And somewhere beyond the front, that distinction is already beginning to matter more than anyone yet realizes. The arrival of the 76mm gun is greeted with cautious optimism. On paper, it promises improvement. Higher muzzle velocity, flatter trajectory, better penetration. Crews sense immediately that it is different from what came before. Shots reach farther. Impacts sound heavier. Yet, improvement is not the same as dominance, and the battlefield makes that distinction quickly. Against lighter vehicles and field fortifications, the 76mm performs convincingly. But against the Panther's frontal armor, the result remains uncertain. Standard armor-piercing capped rounds still struggle to defeat the glacis. At the distances where combat now unfolds, geometry continues to matter more than intent. The shell strikes, and too often, the familiar deflection follows. Penetration becomes conditional. Range shortens the odds, angle decides them, luck finishes the calculation. A hit at 100 meters might succeed where the same shot at 300 fails. A slight change in slope can turn promise into futility. Crews begin to understand that effectiveness is no longer binary, but probabilistic. This forces a new kind of discipline. Gun crews learn distances not from range cards, but from repetition. They estimate by instinct, judging fields, hedgerows, and road widths at a glance. Engagements are delayed or forced based on these calculations. The decision to fire becomes as important as the aim itself. Despite the upgrade, Panthers remain dangerous head-on. The 76mm narrows the gap, but it does not close it. German crews still trust their frontal armor, and with reason. When a Panther fires back, its lethality remains decisive. The window for success is small and unforgiving. Frustration builds not with the crews, but with the limits imposed upon them. Attention shifts away from tactics and toward ordnance. The gun, it seems, is capable. The problem lies in what it fires. Questions return to the same point: velocity, mass, and energy. What if the shell itself could change? Within ordnance departments, that question has already been asked. Engineers are experimenting with solutions that abandon tradition in favor of physics. They are constrained by materials, production, and priority, but the concept exists. A projectile that trades weight for speed, a round designed not to batter armor, but to pierce it through concentration of force. For the men at the front, this knowledge is distant and incomplete. They continue to fight with what they have, extracting marginal advantages where possible. But the sense grows that the answer will not come from another maneuver or another drill. It will come from something smaller, faster, and far more precise. And while Panthers still dominate the frontal fight, the balance is no longer static. Somewhere behind the lines, a different kind of solution is being prepared, one that will test whether physics can succeed where doctrine and steel have failed. High-velocity armor piercing represents a quiet departure from tradition. Where earlier solutions relied on heavier shells and thicker steel, HVAP abandons mass in favor of speed. It accepts a counterintuitive truth. Penetration is not achieved by weight alone, but by the concentration of energy at the moment of impact. Less material, moving faster, can do what more material cannot. At the center of the design is tungsten. Dense, rare, and unforgiving, it allows a small core to retain integrity at extreme velocity. When fired, the HVAP round sheds its outer casing and drives that core forward, focusing force into a narrow point. Armor is no longer bludgeoned. It is pierced. The equation shifts from endurance to inevitability. This is not a philosophical change, but a physical one. Sloped armor works by dispersing energy, encouraging deflection. HVAP counters by overwhelming that dispersion with velocity. The shell arrives faster than steel can respond as intended. Geometry still matters, but physics now presses harder than design assumptions. Yet innovation moves slower than need. Tungsten is scarce, required for machine tools, aircraft engines, and other priorities that compete fiercely for allocation. Production remains limited. HVAP cannot be issued broadly, only selectively. It exists not as a standard solution, but as a controlled resource. Deployment reflects this scarcity. Priority shipments are restricted to certain units, often late, often incomplete. Ammunition racks that once held uniform rounds now contain a small number marked for specific use. Crews are instructed to save them, to choose their moment carefully, though few are told exactly why. Training is minimal. There is no time for doctrine to absorb the change. Gunners receive brief explanations, sometimes only a label on a crate. Expectations remain cautious. After months of bounced rounds and conditional success, optimism has learned restraint. What HVAP offers is not confidence, but possibility. It does not promise victory in every engagement. It offers a chance, a narrow one, to challenge frontal dominance under the right conditions. Crews do not celebrate its arrival. They catalog it, ration it, and wait for proof. The battlefield will provide that proof quickly. Steel does not negotiate, and neither does velocity. Somewhere ahead, a Panther will face a Sherman armed with something fundamentally different. And when that moment comes, the result will not be decided by belief or doctrine, but by whether physics can finally speak louder than armor. The encounter begins without ceremony. A Sherman and a Panther meet head-on, separated by ground that offers no cover and no promise of maneuver. This is the geometry both crews recognize instantly, the kind of fight that has already written its ending many times before. Inside the Sherman, the decision is deliberate. The loader reaches for a round set aside, marked not by confidence but by restraint. HVAP is not fired casually. It is held for moments like this, when there are no alternatives left. The gunner waits, steadying the sight, aware that this shot will not be explained away by luck or distance. It will either work or confirm every doubt that came before. The gun fires. The report is sharper than usual, the recoil familiar but heavier in consequence. The round strikes the Panther's glacis at an angle that would have defeated anything fired before. For a fraction of a second, nothing seems different. Then the expected ricochet does not come. Penetration is immediate. The tungsten core drives through the sloped armor and into the fighting compartment beyond. The effect is catastrophic, not dramatic. Steel fragments scatter inward. Systems fail. The Panther's advantage, carefully engineered and repeatedly proven, collapses in a single instant. Inside the German tank, disbelief arrives before understanding. The glacis has always held. It is trusted precisely because it has never failed. Now it has. The assumption that underpinned every frontal engagement dissolves without warning. There is no time to reinterpret what has happened. Inside the Sherman, there is no celebration. The crew watches, silent, absorbing what they are seeing. Relief does not arrive as triumph. It arrives as confirmation. The enemy can be killed this way. Not always, not easily, but definitively. This is the moment belief changes. Not officially, not immediately, but irreversibly. The frontal fight is no longer unwinnable by definition. It is dangerous, still uneven, but no longer closed. The psychological boundary that favored one side without question has been breached. The significance spreads quietly. Crews do not speak in slogans. They speak in specifics. Range, angle, ammunition. The story passes not as legend, but as instruction. It alters behavior subtly, decisively. Choices expand where none existed before. For German crews, the effect is just as profound. The certainty that once anchored frontal dominance weakens. Armor that could be trusted implicitly now carries doubt. Every engagement becomes a calculation again, not an assumption. Nothing else on the battlefield changes immediately. Panthers remain lethal, HVAP remains scarce. Losses continue. But something essential has shifted beneath the surface. Superiority is no longer absolute. It must be proven each time. And once belief changes, it cannot be restored by steel alone. The change is subtle at first, almost imperceptible. German crews do not abandon their confidence overnight. Doctrine does not vanish because of a single loss. But something essential has been disturbed. The frontal armor that once felt absolute now carries uncertainty, and uncertainty alters behavior long before it appears in reports. Panther crews can no longer assume immunity. Where once a head-on engagement promised control, it now demands calculation. The glacis plate is still strong, still sloped, still formidable, but no longer unquestioned. Each incoming Sherman is evaluated differently. The first shot is still expected to kill, but the penalty for misjudgment has increased. Engagement ranges begin to change. Panthers no longer linger confidently at distances that once guaranteed safety. Some encounters close rapidly, others break off prematurely. The rhythm of combat loses its predictability. What had been a disciplined pattern becomes uneven, shaped by caution rather than certainty. Hesitation appears where confidence once lived, a pause before firing, a brief adjustment in position. These moments are small, measured in seconds, but they matter. In armored warfare, seconds create opportunity. The Panther, designed to dominate decisively, now spends time deciding. For the first time, Panthers maneuver defensively. They angle away rather than forward. They seek hold-down positions not just for advantage, but for reassurance. Movement becomes protective rather than assertive. The change is not dramatic, but it is consistent enough to be noticed by those facing it. The Sherman crews feel it before they fully understand it. Encounters unfold differently. Panthers break contact more readily. Shots are delayed. Openings appear where none existed before. The Sherman, long accustomed to reacting, begins to sense initiative returning in fragments. This shift does not reverse the balance of power outright. Panthers remain lethal. HVAP remains scarce. But the psychological equation has changed. The Sherman no longer approaches an engagement as a foregone conclusion. Choice re-enters the fight, where to engage, when to fire, when to press. German command begins to notice the results before it understands the cause. Reports reference unusual losses. Frontal engagements that once ended quickly now stretch or fail entirely. The explanations are cautious, phrased carefully, but the implication is unavoidable. Something has altered the expected outcome. Superiority becomes conditional. It depends on range, angle, ammunition, and timing. It must be asserted repeatedly rather than assumed. This is a fundamental shift. Doctrines built on inevitability struggle when inevitability disappears. For both sides, the battlefield feels different now. The rules have not been rewritten, but they have been amended. Armor still matters. Guns still decide. But belief, once aligned neatly with design, has fractured. And when belief fractures, the war enters a new phase. One where advantage exists, but only temporarily. One where every engagement must be earned again. HVAP does not arrive as a transformation. It arrives as an exception. It is scarce by design, constrained by materials and priorities far removed from the hedgerows where it is most needed. A Sherman does not carry it as a default solution, but as a limited option counted carefully, issued sparingly, and never assumed to be available when contact begins. Logistics shape its presence more than doctrine ever could. Tungsten shortages restrict production. Distribution favors certain units, certain sectors, certain moments deemed critical by planners who cannot see the battlefield directly. A crew may know HVAP exists and still never fire it. Others may receive a handful of rounds and be told to make them last. Availability becomes uneven, unpredictable, and decisive in its absence. Even where HVAP is present, Panthers remain lethal. Their guns do not lose velocity because a new shell exists. Their armor still defeats most incoming fire. A frontal engagement remains dangerous, especially when HVAP is expended or withheld too long. The Sherman is no longer helpless, but it is far from dominant. This reality reinforces an older truth. Tactics still matter more than equipment alone. HVAP does not absolve poor positioning or reckless exposure. It rewards discipline, patience, and judgment. A well-timed shot can alter an engagement. A wasted one can leave a crew worse off than before. Technology widens possibility, but it does not remove consequence. Crews learn to choose their moments with precision. HVAP is reserved for angles that justify its use, distances that favor success, and targets that matter most. The decision to fire becomes strategic rather than reactive. Each round represents an opportunity that will not be replaced easily. Victory, when it comes, remains situational. A Sherman with HVAP, proper positioning, and initiative can now defeat a Panther frontally, but only under specific conditions. Outside those conditions, the old dangers return. The battlefield does not become forgiving simply because a new solution exists. This nuance is often lost in hindsight. HVAP is later remembered as a corrective, a technological answer to imbalance. In reality, it is a partial remedy operating within strict limits. It shifts the balance without resolving it. It narrows the gap without closing it. For crews, the psychological effect matters as much as the physical one. Knowing that a frontal kill is possible changes behavior. Fear becomes managed rather than absolute. But fear does not disappear. The Panther's presence still commands respect. Engagements are approached with calculation, not confidence. The balance shifts, but danger remains. HVAP introduces uncertainty, where certainty once favored only one side. It creates choice where none existed. But it does not rewrite the nature of armored warfare. Steel is still unforgiving. Errors are still final. In this sense, HVAP does not fix the Sherman. It does something more subtle and more realistic. It restores contest. It turns inevitability into probability. And in a war where seconds decide survival, that difference, however limited, is enough to matter profoundly. The most important change does not arrive with a new vehicle or a revised manual. It arrives quietly, inside the crews themselves. For the first time since Normandy, American tankers begin to feel agency. Not optimism, not superiority, but the sense that their actions can shape an engagement rather than merely endure it. Fear does not vanish. It recalibrates. What was once absolute and ever-present certainty of frontal defeat becomes conditional. Crews still respect the Panther. They still understand its lethality. But fear is no longer paralyzing. It becomes something to be managed, weighed against opportunity, contained by preparation. This alters behavior immediately. Engagements are no longer avoided reflexively. Crews begin choosing when to fight, not simply reacting when contact occurs. Terrain is evaluated differently. Angles are considered. Distance matters again. The battlefield feels less like a trap and more like a problem that can be solved. Gunnery confidence follows. Knowing that penetration is possible changes how shots are taken. Gunners steady longer. They wait for alignment rather than firing in desperation. Accuracy improves not because the gun is different, but because belief has shifted. The act of aiming regains meaning. As these changes accumulate, doctrine begins to lag less severely behind experience. Reports from the field reflect new realities. Ammunition is discussed with specificity. Engagement outcomes are analyzed with nuance rather than dismissal. The system does not transform overnight, but it begins, finally, to listen. Survivability improves incrementally, not dramatically, not uniformly, but measurably. Crews make fewer frontal approaches without purpose. Exposure time shortens. Withdrawal becomes tactical rather than panicked. These gains are small in isolation, but cumulative in effect. Fewer tanks are lost needlessly. More crews return. Morale stabilizes under fire. This does not mean confidence is high. It means it is durable. Tankers no longer feel expendable by design. They feel challenged, endangered, but not dismissed by their equipment. That distinction matters deeply to men who must trust a machine with their lives. The shift is subtle enough that it is rarely captured in after-action reports. It lives in habits rather than headlines, in how a commander positions his vehicle, in how a loader watches range, in how a crew stays together after a near miss, instead of scattering emotionally. This psychological adjustment does not win the war. It does not negate losses, but it changes how those losses are understood. Defeat is no longer assumed as the natural outcome of certain encounters. Survival feels earned, not borrowed. In war, belief is a form of armor, not thick enough to stop a shell, but strong enough to shape decisions before the shell is ever fired. By restoring that belief partially, imperfectly, HVAP alters more than penetration tables. It alters the relationship between men and the battlefield. And in the closing months of the war, that relationship will matter as much as any machine rolling forward through the smoke. HVAP does not rewrite the identity of the Sherman, but it reframes the argument around it. The war reveals, with uncomfortable clarity, that ammunition can be as decisive as armor. Steel, thickness, and turret profiles matter, but only in relation to what strikes them. A gun is defined not just by its barrel, but by the physics it delivers at the point of impact. In this sense, HVAP represents a triumph of physics over philosophy. German design had relied on geometry and expectation, on the idea that sloped armor would reliably disperse force. HVAP does not challenge that idea rhetorically. It simply overwhelms it. Velocity concentrates energy faster than steel can redirect it. The solution is not louder doctrine, but a different equation. Yet this breakthrough remains constrained by industry. Tungsten shortages, production limits, and competing priorities ensure that HVAP never becomes universal. Tactical reality is shaped not only by innovation, but by what can be manufactured, shipped, and issued at scale. The battlefield reflects the factory as much as the design bureau. Doctrine adapts too slowly to spare the early casualties. By the time HVAP proves its value, many crews have already learned the truth through loss. Manuals follow experience, not the other way around. The delay is not negligence, it is the friction inherent in large systems, but its cost is borne unevenly by those who fought before adaptation arrived. The Sherman itself remains imperfect. It is still vulnerable. It still relies on coordination, positioning, and judgment to survive. But it is no longer helpless in the most punishing test of armored warfare, the frontal encounter. Possibility has replaced inevitability. Choice has returned where none existed. This marks a quiet transition in tank warfare. Superiority can no longer be assumed based solely on design lineage. It becomes temporary, situational, and contested. Advantage belongs to those who can combine machine, ammunition, and decision-making at the right moment. The battlefield grows less predictable and therefore more dangerous for everyone. HVAP does not end fear, but it redistributes it. German crews lose certainty. American crews gain conditional confidence. Neither side escapes risk, but both must now calculate it anew. The war becomes less about whose tank is untouchable, and more about whose assumptions fail last. In retrospect, the lesson is not technological alone. It is philosophical. No system remains dominant forever. No advantage survives contact with changing conditions. The Panther is not defeated by imitation, but by adaptation, by a willingness to abandon what once worked in favor of what now must. What HVAP really changes is not the balance of armor, but the balance of belief. It proves that even in a war of steel, solutions can come from rethinking the smallest components. And it reminds every army, in every era, that superiority is never permanent. It must be earned again and again under fire. Veterans remember the first time they saw a Panther die from the front. Not as a spectacle, not as a story polished by time, but as a moment of quiet recalibration. The image stayed with them because it contradicted everything they had learned through loss. The enemy that had once felt immune had failed, plainly and irrevocably. There was no cheering, no sense of triumph. What followed was relief measured, almost restrained. Relief that the rules they had been forced to accept were not immutable. Relief that the battlefield was no longer governed entirely by assumptions that favored the other side. It was not joy, it was permission to breathe. The ground felt different after that. Not safer, but negotiable. Engagements were no longer entered with resignation. They became problems again, dangerous ones, but solvable. The sense that outcomes could vary returned. Choice mattered. Judgment mattered. Survival felt connected once more to action rather than chance. Power did not shift dramatically. There was no sudden reversal of fortune, no collapse of German armored strength. Panthers continued to kill Shermans. HVAP remained rare. Losses continued. But the shift did not need to be dramatic to be decisive. It needed only to be real. Technology did not erase fear. It corrected imbalance. The men inside the tanks were still vulnerable, still mortal, still aware that a single mistake could be final. What changed was not the danger, but its distribution. Fear no longer belonged exclusively to one side of the engagement. HVAP did not make the Shermans superior. It did not transform it into a machine of dominance. What it did was far more modest and far more important. It made the Sherman dangerous in circumstances where it had once been merely present. It restored reciprocity to the fight. For German crews, the loss of certainty was profound. Frontal armor could no longer be trusted implicitly. The doctrine that had promised inevitability now demanded caution. Confidence, once structural, became conditional. Every engagement carried risk again. For American crews, belief returned gradually. Not belief in invincibility, but belief in relevance, in being heard by the battlefield, in having a voice in how an encounter might end. That belief sustained them through the final months of the war more reliably than any statistic. In hindsight, the lesson reaches beyond tanks and ammunition. It speaks to the limits of permanence in war. Every advantage is temporary. Every solution invites a counter. Steel, no matter how carefully shaped, eventually meets a force that exposes its limits. They built the Panther to be untouchable. It was not arrogance, it was confidence, grounded in engineering and experience. But war does not reward permanence. It rewards adaptation, often from unexpected directions. One shell proved what the battlefield eventually teaches every generation. No machine is beyond reach forever. And when steel stopped being one-sided, the war did not become easier. It became honest again.